kind of born into the gig. My father founded the museum in 2003. And we first opened to the public in 2005 with a small collection of 2.5 airplanes, depending on how you count. And that snowballed a little bit out of control. So we now have 11 flying World War II airplanes, everything from Piper Cubs all the way to P-51 Mustangs or P-40s, as you see here. So we'll take a walk around the museum. And we'll stop and talk about a few of the more significant and interesting aircraft in the collection. We'll spend most of our time talking about airplanes that we restored in-house. So a little bit about the museum. We have 11 employees, 5 of whom are dedicated to maintaining and restoring the airplanes. One of the things that sets us apart from a lot of museums is that we are not a static museum. Everything you're going to see tonight is either an airworthy and flying airplane or is a restoration project that is on the way to being an airworthy aircraft. So we don't have any barriers between people and the aircraft. You can get as close as you want to take in all the details and some of the interesting points and engineering examples and things about the airplanes that you might find notable. So you can get up and close and personal and see everything about them. Why don't we start right behind me with the North American P-51D Mustang. So this was the first airplane that was restored by Tri State Warbird Museum staff. It was completed in 2005. It's since flown somewhere in the 600 total hours flying range. The P-51 Mustang was known by many as the aircraft that won World War II for the Allied forces. And the thing that set it apart from many of the aircraft of its time was just how efficient it was. And so in the European theater, the thing that we were struggling with the most was escorting our bombers all the way into enemy territory with fighters and returning home with them. So a lot of our airplanes, like the P-40, which we'll see behind us, didn't have the fuel economy to fly all the way into occupied France or Germany, escorting our bombers and keeping them safe and flying them all the way back to England. So the P-51 Mustang came along and it was able to fly high, which meant it was flying through thinner air. It made horsepower up to 35,000 feet in the air. The air is thinner up there, so there's not as much drag, so you can turn down the power and not use as much fuel. So these airplanes were able to fly B-17s all the way into Germany and all the way back and escort our bombers home safely up until the point where the Mustang came into the war. We were experiencing extremely heavy bomber losses, which was detrimental to the war effort, but also morale. We were losing a lot of people. And so the Mustang was one of the things that really turned the air war around. Our example, as I said, was completed in 2005. So the Mustang is 1,500 horsepower and 400 miles an hour in rough numbers. We named it Cincinnati Miss. That's not an actual historical nose art scheme that you would have found on a World War II original aircraft, but this is my dad's airplane, and he took poetic license and named it after the city where he lived. It was modeled after the 353rd Fighter Group, which would have been based out of Reading, England. So everything but the name Cincinnati Miss would have been original. This is how you would have seen P-51s look in Reading in 1944 and 1945. So we can take a minute and walk around, and we can talk about some of the things that made the Mustang what it was. So the first one that, Sheehan, if you can kind of point it at the nose of the P-40 for a second. The Mustang, like I said, turned the tide of aerodynamic efficiency. So if we are looking at the P-40 right now, the P-40 has a lot of frontal area. You see a big amount of mass and flat area in the front and the nose, and the wing was very thick. And so what that produced was a lot of drag, which slowed it down and made it require more power to push through the air. And to do that, you used more fuel. So you couldn't go as far. That was the primary problem that we were struggling with. So on the Mustang, the entire approach was on efficiency of drag. So one of the examples of that is the laminar flow wing profile that you see on the Mustang wing. It's very thin. And as a result, it doesn't cause as much drag pushing it through the air, but it still makes a lot of lift. The other area that they cleaned up significantly was the nose. So if Sheehan showed you what the nose of the P40 looked like. Now, if we come and look at the nose of the Mustang, you don't have to be an aerodynamicist to notice that it's much more sleek. If you think of the word sleek, that's, as far as aerodynamics are concerned, very, very good. So the Mustang cut down on the frontal area. And one of the ways that it did that, so then all that stuff on the nose of the P40 is air inlets to the oil cooler and the radiator. The inline fighter engines were water cooled. And so there was a radiator which required air to flow through it to cool the water down. So North American engineered a way to use that requirement of water flowing through a radiator and mitigate the drag that caused. So one of the quintessential visual iconic aspects of the P-51 Mustang is the radiator scoop on the bottom of the fuselage. So you can see it down there, and every aerial picture photograph of a Mustang, that's the thing that kind of sets it apart. That and its bubble canopy is, you can tell it's a Mustang because it's got that scoop on the bottom of it. But one of the really interesting things about that scoop is, and it's one of the things that I love about aeronautical engineering in general in World War II, is that everything was need-based. And so they saw a problem and they used brain power and pencil and paper and slide rule. In the age of computers, that seems unfathomable, but this airplane was designed with pencil and paper and slide rule, not a computer. I mean, barely a calculator. Anyways, they had this problem. They needed to cool the water that cooled the engine. And so they had to take air in. And so they used ingenuity to mitigate that problem. So putting a scoop out in the airstream causes drag. They used a principle called the Meredith effect. The Meredith effect, and I'm not an engineer, so this is going to be bobbled a little bit, but it basically works on the premise that air that's being rapidly heated in a area that's shrinking can cause thrust. And so the scoop on the bottom of the P-51 Mustang actually generates a little bit of thrust, essentially offsetting the drag that's caused by hanging the scoop down there in the airstream. So that's one of the things that, it's a sum of its parts, all of the different little things, the laminar flow wing, sleek nose, bigger supercharger so that it can go higher, the scoop on the bottom, and the Meredith effect all add up to an airplane that really saved the air war in Europe. So we'll take a minute and walk around. And as a segue to talking about our next aircraft, one of the things you'll notice about our Mustang is that it's quite shiny. That is not how it would have actually looked in World War II. Needless to say, aesthetics weren't the primary concern when manufacturing aircraft. It was how quickly can you get them out and how well can they fly. Many aircraft in modern restorations are painted in a more robust way. A lot of these airplanes, the useful life that they experience would be minutes, days, weeks, or months before they were crashed, out of service due to maintenance issues, all kinds of stuff. So they weren't designed to stand the test of time in terms of paint jobs and all that kind of stuff. We did that because this airplane flies to air shows all the time. It sits outside, and so it's got what you'd really kind of think of as a modern show car paint job. It's got miles and miles of clear coat to protect it from the elements and that kind of stuff. Our second restoration project was the P40, which in large respect could be considered a predecessor to the P-51 Mustang. As an aside, North American Aviation built the P-51 Mustang, and one of the cool stories about the Mustang is that North American went from a blank sheet of paper to a flying prototype in roughly 100 days. The reason for that was the US government approached North American and asked them to build P-40s under license because Curtiss, who manufactured the P-40, was at their production capacity and we needed more airplanes. North American wasn't really keen on the idea of building someone else's airplane. They had built a bunch of other airplanes during World War II, which we'll talk about. And they said, well, we've got this idea for an airplane that would, blow the P-40 out of the water, but it's just in our heads. It's not a thing we're tooled up to produce. And the government said, okay, you have the time it would take you to tool up to build P-40s in your factory to prove that you've got this better idea. and that's what became the P-51 Mustang. So here's the P-40. Like I said, the P-40, by the time the Americans were involved in World War II, was largely obsolete. It had a bunch of drag, it couldn't go as high, it couldn't go as fast as the Mustang, but it still had a purpose. There were still uses for it. And in the case of our aircraft that you see in front of you, this airplane was part of the Lend-Lease program, which started before, during a period of American neutrality. It continued after we were involved in World War II. This airplane was built by Curtiss Wright in Buffalo, New York in 1943. They put it in a shipping container and shipped it to New Zealand, where it was accepted by the Royal New Zealand Air Force and used in New Zealand in the Pacific Theater in World War II. After the war, it was sold as surplus scrap, and we can zoom in here and show you what it started its restoration life as in a junkyard in Auckland, New Zealand. The wings were cut off with a torch, the engine mounts and everything forward of basically the windshield was cut off with a torch, and it sat there for the better part of 50 years. We acquired it, put it in a shipping container, shipped it back to the United States for the first time since the 40s, and spent 45,000 human working hours restoring this airplane between January of 2007 and June of 2016. So we talked about some of the things that made the Mustang not a super original or authentic as it would have been in theater version of a P-51. Our entire goal, the overarching theme of the restoration of this P-40, was to make it as close as we could possibly make it to exactly what it would have looked like rolling out of the factory in Buffalo, New York in 1943. The Mustang restoration took 35,000 hours. The P-40 took 45,000. Most of that 10,000 hour delta was in meticulous, make it original, make it authentic, research exactly what it would have actually looked like, as opposed to make it good, make it look good, make it functional, make it safe. It was verify in any way we possibly could, reference material, blueprints, make it exactly as it would have been in World War II. Some things we had to, compromise on for modern reasons. So the batteries that would have been used in the airplane in World War II no longer exist. So we put a modern aviation battery in a box that we made that looks exactly like the original battery. We can walk around here and look at some of the details. This airplane has all the original equipment that would have been equipped with in theater. So the ammunition racks are filled with chutes of dead ammunition. It's got replica guns with working gun solenoids. So if you're flying along in this airplane today and you pull the trigger on the control stick, the solenoids on the guns click. And if the ammunition actually worked, they'd actually fire. The government doesn't really want anybody flying around in a World War II airplane with 400 miles an hour and 50 calibers of live ammunition. So we haven't endeavored to make it that realistic. But like I said, the theme for this entire airplane was originality, make it as authentic as possible. And I think we can probably get the camera up, show the cockpit. The cockpit is exactly as it would have been in the 40s. So we have all the original instruments, they all function. We've got a functioning gun sight. No modern avionics of any kind. It's exactly what the pilots that flew this in World War II would have been looking at. To that end, we kept that theme throughout the entire airplane. So if you want to look in the radio compartment here in the back of the fuselage, this airplane would have served, or airplanes like it would have served in the Solomon Islands, places like Guadalcanal. Those radios are tuned to the frequencies that the Royal New Zealand Air Force used in World War II in the Solomon Islands. The radios function. There's nobody on the other end talking on those radio frequencies, but if there were, they could talk to us. One really interesting note is this airplane was equipped with a radio detonation system, so that if you had an incident, you crashed in this airplane and had to desert it, there was a system that was designed to detonate and render non-functional the radios in such a way that the enemy couldn't capture our radio frequencies so they could listen in on what was happening. Another highlight that's in the area of not necessary to make it airworthy, but certainly necessary to make it an artifact. So our goal was to make this look like exactly the artifact that it represents. And so things that weren't necessary but really spoke to the originality of the aircraft, we did anyway. So in World War II, wire was cotton wrapped copper. We now know that cotton isn't very abrasion resistant, and as a result, not very safe. So what we did is we wired the entire airplane, thousands of feet of wire throughout the wings, the full length of the fuselage, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of wires with modern Teflon mil-spec wiring. And we had custom woven nylon or cotton sleeves that we sleeved every single individual wire with to make it look original. So I hope you can see the patterns on a lot of those wires all indicate different things based on the functionality of the wire, where it was going, what it was supposed to be doing. And it's not just in this compartment where you can open up an access door and see it. The entire airplane, nose to tail, every single wire is jacketed that way because that's how it was done in 1943. The entire airplane is like that. You know, if I had to wager, I guess I'd say there's somewhere between 2 and 5 airplanes, World War II fighters on the planet that are restored to this level of authenticity, that well and truly look exactly as they would have looked in 1943 or 4 or 5 or whenever it was manufactured. This is in almost every single way entirely indistinguishable from when it was brand new. It was finally completed in the summer of 2016. We then flew it to the EAA AirVenture Oshkosh Air Show in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, which is one of the largest civilian aircraft-based air shows on the planet, and where it won Grand Champion, which is the basically the best in show for the industry award. I think that's, unless we want to dive really far down the rabbit hole of P40, enough if we can move on. Do we have any questions yet while we're walking to a different portion of the building? Good, all right. We'll do one more thing before we leave the P40. Flying 80-year-old war machines is certainly a dangerous thing. And we've been involved in some of that danger manifesting itself in reality. So we finished this airplane originally in 2011 and had a brand new old stock oil cooler suffer a mechanical failure, brand new out of the box. And on one of the airplane's original test flights, the oil cooler failed. It ventilated all the oil out of the system. And from the time that the last amount of oil was gone to the point where the engine dead stop ceased to not turning the propeller anymore ever again was a matter of seconds. The pilot was roughly 7 miles from the airport with no engine, kicked this piston out of the block. There's holes all over the place. Fortunately, skill, good fortune, luck, someone looking down upon us that day, the airplane made it back to the airport. Unfortunately, one of the things that happens when you lose an engine is you don't give up any energy that you can't get back. And so when the pilot got to the airport, he was going too fast to stop on the runway, and it went through the fence at the end of the runway, tore the wing up, tore the landing gear off of it, and tore the propeller. The engine was obviously shredded to bits. But the reason I bring this up is it's probably one of the cooler aspects of the airplane is we were out of propeller, we were out of spinner, the engine was junk. And these are all old airplanes, and we can make sheet metal from scratch without too much trouble. But there are some portions of this airplane that, you know, there are a finite number of. Manufacturing them from scratch is, you know, fiscally impossible anyways, if not physically. So things like propellers that are, you know, complex cast and machined pieces is a challenge. We were fortunate enough to find a set of brand new Curtis Electric propeller blades for a P-40 in a crate from brand new in World War II that had never been opened. And so if you look at the rest of this airplane and you walk around it, you realize that there's not even a paint chip or a scratch on the thing. And so people kind of look at us and go, why are your stickers on your propeller all chipping away like that? And the reality is it's because they've been in a box since 1940. And we thought about making the stickers look perfect and decided we couldn't. They're brand new old stock blades from World War II that never been out of the box until they went on our airplane, and they had to stay like that. And so that's a question that we get asked a lot is, where do you find stuff? Pure, blind, dumb luck sometimes. Sometimes it's just possessing the fortitude to keep looking when things never turn up. An example of that is Curtis put the gun camera for the P-40 right here. And in airplanes like the Mustang, they're pointing straight forward and the lens is going the same direction as the wing. But in the P-40, they didn't have the luxury of doing that. The camera's actually pointed this way. So there's this little 90-degree adapter fitting that goes on the lens that changes the focal direction of the camera out the end of the wing. We found the camera. It took us like 6.5 years to find that silly little lens. When you say, well, does it really matter? No, but the point of the airplane was make it original. And so when you pull the trigger on the stick, the gun solenoids click, but the gun camera film cycles. There's actually exposed film in the gun camera right now. All right, moving on. So we built this building in 2005. Basically all the airplanes you see here, except for the little Piper Cub in the front, were in this airplane, but we also had 1, 2, 3, 4 more airplanes in here at the same time, and we were out of room. Fortunately, we've had a bunch of great donors from the Cincinnati community, both private donors as well as corporate sponsors. We had a corporate sponsor donate $1 million in one shot to building a second hangar. We were, like I said, we were out of room. Our guys were tripping over each other, and the airplanes were all packed in here like sardines. So I think probably our two most notable or interesting aircraft in this hangar that we'll talk about. We'll get to the restoration project in a minute.
David?
Yes.
Sorry, when you went through the area from, I think, one hangar to the next, we lost you for a second. Can you repeat just the final things that you said right before you walked into this room?
Okay, we had a corporate donor donate $1 million to build a second hangar. We were out of room. We had 7.5 airplanes all crammed into a 10,000 square foot hangar. And so we needed some breathing room to be able to more efficiently work, to restore these airplanes. We were at the point where if we had to move one airplane out, 6 airplanes had to move to, make the Tetris puzzle work to get the airplane out. So we finished construction of this building in 2011. This is where the active heavy restoration and maintenance work happens. The first hangar is mostly a display hangar. Everything there is done, complete, clean, and unneeding and airworthy, yes, and doesn't need anything. This is where all the major work happens. So we've got a restoration project to my right, which I think we'll end with, but we'll talk about 2 of our more notable aircraft in the museum's collection first. We'll start with the fan favorite, our biggest and loudest airplane. Maybe if you want, you can stand here if you want. So this is Yankee Doodle, our B-25 Mitchell. The B-25 Mitchell was a medium bomber from World War II. It flew all over the place, China, India, Africa. Our airplane is the second to last B-25 manufactured in World War II. So it was actually manufactured after the war was ended to complete the the order that the U.S. Army, Air Corps, and Air Forces made with North American. This was built by North American, the same company that built the P-51 Mustang. So the B-25 is a medium bomber. It's max gross in the 30,000 pound range, makes roughly 3,500 horsepower from two engines, two 2,600 cubic inch engines. Some things about the B-25 in general, some interesting facts. For those of you who are familiar with the Doolittle raid, the B-25 was the aircraft used in the Doolittle raid. It marked the first American offensive on mainland Japan following the attack on Pearl Harbor. I believe in April of 1942, Jimmy Doolittle came up with a plan to fly 18 B-25 bombers off of an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, fly them over mainland Japan, bomb Japan, and land in China. The plan was potentially spotted by a Japanese fishing boat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and the actual launch of the airplanes happened earlier and further away from Japan than was intended. And as a result, the mission was largely seen as a suicide mission because there was no ability to tell whether they were actually going to be able to make it to China. And in fact, most of the airplanes ditched in the ocean following dropping bombs on Japan. Some of them actually made it to China, some of them made it to Russia, but basically everybody had to bail out. Our airplane was not involved in the Doolittle raid, but this is the airplane that would have participated in that mission. And I think one of the things that's really taking about that is picturing something this big, and not just one of them, but 18 of these humongous medium bombers, somewhere between 20 and 30,000 pounds, taking off in 550 or 600 feet off of the deck of an aircraft carrier. It's pretty amazing. And it's one of those things about World War II that I think is often lost, is the commitment and the bravery that the men and women that served in World War II had in an unwavering way. That's a mission that most people would have scoffed at in modern times, but when Jimmy Doolittle asked for volunteers and told the guys he was asking to do this mission that they didn't have to do it if they didn't want to, every single one of them stood up and said, "We're in," which I think is pretty interesting. Some interesting facts about our airplane. Like I said, it was the second to last one manufactured. It was built in September, I believe, of 2005 or 1945. And you're looking right now at the nose art. So, like I said, this airplane is called Yankee Doodle. That's a new paint scheme the airplane got in 2018. We actually flew this airplane across the Atlantic Ocean using the original North Atlantic ferry route used by aircraft in World War II, and flew it to Sardinia, Italy, where it was used to film Hulu miniseries remake of the book Catch-22, which was produced and directed by George Clooney. They approached us in early 2018 and asked us, "Do you want to fly your airplane to Europe to film a TV show?" And we said, "Probably not, but I guess maybe we can talk about it." And 4 months later, they took off and flew 31 hours across the Atlantic Ocean. And this entire paint scheme that you see was done in 2 days on the set of the TV show production. And one of the things that we originally, it's temporary. They say that with some elbow grease, hot water, and soap, the whole thing will wash off in a couple days. But I think we left it because it kind of tells a story. Like I said, the P-51 paint job is shiny and beautiful and perfect, and the P-40 is unscratched. And those both tell their own story. But the B-25, looking like this, looking battle scarred and war torn, and the nose art being hand painted by an actual artist, as opposed to shot with a spray gun in a paint booth, tells an entirely different story of what this airplane really would have looked like in the throes of battle in World War II in Italy. This airplane very, very well could have actually looked like this on a sandy airstrip in Sardinia in the 40s. So we left it. There's a lot of hand-done details to weather it, to make it look dirty and worn out, and paint chipping and exhaust streaked and muddy and gross. And so a lot of people think, "What? Are you ever going to wash your airplane?" And the reality is that it actually is clean. It just doesn't look like it because it's got the Hollywood touch on it, I guess. So like I said, the airplane flew across the Atlantic Ocean. Took 31 hours to get there. I think it took 35 to get back, flying against tail or headwinds the whole way home. Um, Fuel bill each way was about $50,000. Fortunately, Hollywood was footing that bill. It was an interesting experience. For those of you who are interested, it's a 6-part, 6-hour miniseries on Hulu. It's on there right now. You can go look it up. And our airplane was the hero airplane in the filming. So anytime you see an airplane at the front of the squadron, that's actually our airplane. The rest of it, they used our airplane and one other to build a CGI computer model. But the one at the front, that's our airplane. That's really ours. Oh yeah, and the airplane's gotten a lot of fanfare and public attention because of the TV show. So there's a video game called War Thunder that somebody recently built a visual model of this airplane. So you can actually go fly our airplane in a video game if you're so inclined. And we will turn around this way and look at what I would probably consider our rarest aircraft in the collection. What you're looking at is the only non-allied airplane in our collection. It's a Focke-Wulf FW190 F8. The German answer or competitor or peer, depending on how you look at things, to the P-51 Mustang. It went about achieving the performance it had in different ways than the Mustang. And that's one of the things that I think is great about our museum and the collection is that you have a P-51 and an FW190 in the same building, and you can kind of take your time and look at a Mustang and then look at the Focke-Wulf and really see the differences between the German approach and the American approach to building an aircraft built to wage a war. There's some challenging imagery on the airplane, which often gets brought up, but we're a history museum, and this is an example of an aircraft, and it's that imagery, while challenging, is something that on our side of history we don't believe should be whitewashed. Strangely enough, this airplane's been in a couple German magazines, and the swastika on the tail gets photoshopped out of the photographs. But we believe it's something to be talked about. It's something that we can all learn from. So post-war Germany, they lost the war, and the entire German war machine, anything that even looked like it was capable of waging war or being used to wage war, was destroyed. And so what that means is there's maybe 170 flying examples of a P-51, and there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 or 8 Focke-Wulfs, because the only thing that was left after they destroyed everything was crash site relics, that some of them were in lakes in Russia, that there was barely anything left. So our airplane is technically a reproduction. It's got an original data plate, so in the eyes of the FAA, this is a real Focke-Wulf. And airplane terms, the data plate is the airplane and everything else is secondary. But realistically, this is 99% newly manufactured airplane to look like built to the original plans to the airplane. There's some original parts. All the tailwheel assembly is pretty much original FW190 stuff, but basically everything else has been remade from scratch in the modern era. The reality is that even there's 2 original airframes flying in the world. One's flying, one's about there. But really, like I said, there were crash site relics, and at least half or more of those are brand new metal too. So it's sort of a blurry line between what is and isn't original. So like I said, there's 7 or 8 of these examples flying in the world, and one of them's here in Cincinnati. And so I've been around airplanes since I learned to walk. And one of the things that I find so interesting about this airplane is I've been to I don't know, 100 and some odd air shows in my life, and I think I can count on one or two fingers the number of German airplanes that have been at the air show for people to experience. And so it's just something that most people don't get the privilege to see and understand and you know take in and really see what they're all about. So the fact that we've got one here for people to see is I think a real treat for people. Like I said, there's very few of them in the world. It's a really cool airplane, and it tells some interesting stories. So the data plate that our airplane is built around is an F8, which was a late war example of the airplane. And you can follow me with the camera. You can see the cross on the wings or the swastika on the tail or the cross on the fuselage are very simple black one color graphics. If you look at early war examples of most German aircraft, those insignias were far more detailed. They were 3 or 4 layers of white, black, alternating patterns. Much more ornate, much more detailed, much more difficult to mask off and paint. This airplane was built when Germany was losing the war, and all they were trying to do was get airplanes out the door. The reality is that a lot of these airplanes, when they were built, were probably only partially painted. They were losing the war, they needed the airplanes, and all that stuff went out the window. So this airplane had 2 functions in terms of its paint scheme. One was get it done quickly. The other was that it was a low visibility airplane. So the faceted, dusted look is to serve a camouflage purpose, and it does a pretty decent job of that. Having been in the air in a chase plane, looking at it, even though it's going fast, it's still you got to pay attention to find it. But I do think it's interesting that little things like we're losing the war, so we don't spend as much time painting our airplanes to look as nicely as they did at the beginning of the war is an interesting story. Another thing that our airplane can do in terms of telling stories about histories, and this kind of goes back to challenging imagery, is this airplane, or the airplane the data plate belonged to and that this airplane represents, was built in a factory in Laredo, which was a factory that had a well-documented history of using forced labor to manufacture the aircraft. So the airplane the data plate belonged to was in large part built by concentration camp inmates who were basically captured versions of the enemy. So there's a lot of stories documented in history of aircraft coming out of the Laredo factory, Focke-Wulf FW-190 aircraft coming out of the factory and suffering interesting challenges on initial test flights. So they're everything from landing gear wheels falling off on the initial takeoff roll because none of the hardware that was used to attach to the airframe was put on properly, or road flares jammed behind exhaust stacks so that once the exhaust got hot and the airplane was in the air, it caught on fire. It's an interesting approach to use your enemy to build your airplanes, waging war against them, and some examples of why that's not such a good idea. It is a very interesting airplane. Like I said, being able to be in this building and see the differences between the American approach and the German approach it's very stark. You can really see the difference between the way we designed and built airplanes and the way the Germans designed and built airplanes, while largely arriving at a similar goal. The Mustang and the FW-190 both had strengths and weaknesses against the other. They were in large respect pretty even matches, given if you kind of line up those strengths and weaknesses together. The Mustang was more efficient. This was maybe a little bit faster. But it is interesting to be able to compare and contrast 2 very different approaches to aeronautical engineering, kind of landing in the same ballpark in terms of performance. So we've got one last example of an airplane, and you've now seen 3 airplanes that our guys built in-house. So now we'll kind of have the opportunity to look at what we start with. So you saw a picture of what the P-40 looked like in the junkyard. This is a chance bought, or in this case, Goodyear manufactured FG-1D Corsair. The airplane is famous for its gull wing shape, which you can see hints of here in the W section of the fuselage. This airplane was actually used to film the television show Black Sheep Squadron, Baba Black Sheep, famous for Robert Conrad and Pappy Boyington. This airplane hasn't flown since the filming the second or third to last episode of that TV show. It suffered some engine issues while they were filming the show. They got another one. They had a bunch of airplanes to film the show. They got another one, and this airplane kind of sat parked and got forgotten about until the 90s when a collector bought it, intending to restore it. Things happened. We ended up buying it from him in the condition you see the main fuselage section. It sat out in basically on a ramp in the desert in Chino, California for quite some time, and is basically as it last flew. We've since taken it apart and started the process of restoring it. The aft section of the fuselage is complete. Got to put the horizontal and vertical tail elements on, but those are also done. The W section, the meat and potatoes of the airplane, where most of the restoration labor will come from, is untouched. It's a vastly complicated airframe in terms of the way they manufactured it. In World War II, as we said, one of the things they were trying to do was design airplanes so that they could be manufactured quickly. We needed as many airplanes as we could make, and so anything we could do to speed up the manufacturing process meant more airplanes got turned out in any given day. So Chance Vaught, who designed the airplane, had finally figured out structural aluminum spot welding. So a lot of the fuselages of this airplane is held together with spot welds. Everything else on the property is almost entirely held together with rivets. We like rivets because they're easy to take apart. These are all spot welds, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. Problem with a spot weld is that if you have to take that panel apart, the panel itself or the one it's attached to, one of them is going to get damaged because you have to drill a hole in one piece or the other to get it apart. And so in the case of this extremely complicated, many curves all coalescing together panel, you're going to put hundreds and hundreds of holes in it. You got to start over again. It's a very complicated process. Anyways, like I said, our airplane was used to film the Black Sheep Squadron TV show. And so you can go out on Amazon Prime, I think, and watch the whole series and see our airplane over and over and over again. And one of the ways you can be sure that what you're seeing is our airplane that's sitting here in the hangar right now is anytime you saw an airplane get shot down and go behind a row of trees or behind a hillside on an island trailing smoke, that's our airplane. They used our airplane exclusively to film those shots because these 4 points on the fuselage were used to bolt a smoke generator that they, it's got an electrical coil in it, and they pour smoke in it and they pour oil in it, and smoke comes out the end. So anytime an airplane got shot down, ours was the one they used to film that. So, like I said, this is what a finished product looks like. The relic airframe that hasn't been flown in 50 years plus is what we start with. We've got, I would say, 10,000 hours of work into this airplane so far. And if we're 40,000 or 50,000 away, I wouldn't be surprised. So this airplane, the timeline is, it's hard to tell. Who knows what we're going to find when we, blow this thing apart into thousands of pieces, but 4 to 10 years. We've got now 5 extremely talented individuals that do the work on these airplanes. But the reality is that there's a lot of reverse engineering and making things from scratch that happens in the process, and it doesn't happen quickly. But the finished product, I think, is worth the time spent on it. I think that's probably close on time. Do we have any questions that I can answer?
So if anyone has any questions and you want to come off mute or put them in the chat box, please, please do either.
We've got one here on the ground if you want to start there.
Perfect.
Sure. So it's a question about they're airworthy, they're flying, how do you see it? So everything's really expensive to fly. For example, the B-25 is a gallon of fuel a minute per engine. So you're talking about 120 gallons of fuel an hour, and that's just the beginning. It's $400 an hour in insurance, blah, blah, blah. The point is, we try and do our best to fly the airplanes as much as possible, because our goal is for the airplanes to tell their own story in their element, making noise and smoke and being able to see them actually doing their thing. We fly them occasionally, something like 4 times a year on site for members on Saturdays. But the best way for you to come and see our airplanes fly is we're annually going to do an event. We started it last year. It was kind of the brainchild of some COVID required adapt and overcome and come up with a new plan things. An event we call the Warbird Flying Showcase. This year it'll, the plan is to have it on September 18th. It'll be a 3 or 4 hour event starting around lunchtime. Kids will be free, and we'll probably fly anywhere from 10 to 15 airplanes for 3 or 4 hours. We'll almost undoubtedly fly everything in this building. So the Focke-Wulf will fly, the B-25 will fly, some airplanes we didn't talk about, TBM, C-45, Mustang, C-47, Bearcat, P-51, maybe P-40, T-6, a lot of stuff. And like I said, it'll be 3 or 4 hours of nonstop flying, lots and lots of fuel turned into noise. And so you can, like, we're on Facebook and Instagram and website, and all that information will be forthcoming.
So this is a very specialized group of mechanics and engineers. How do you find individuals to be a part of the museum and the restoration team?
Well, the reality is that the labor, the specialized labor that grew up doing this kind of stuff is going away. So we have 2 guys on our staff that are 65 or older. And then the rest of our employees are anywhere from 26 to 50. And so a lot of it is trial by fire, learning on the job. We've been fortunate enough to have 4 or 5 employees over the course of the museum's lifetime that were, eat, sleep, and breathe warbirds kind of people, that were also, one other facet of their passion was that they liked teaching. And so our staff have all learned on the job from each other over time. Everybody's learning something new every day, which is a really interesting thing about working here is, you're going to, like, nobody here's ever worked on a Corsair before. We've got the blueprint, they've got talent. We're going to put those 2 things together and come out with a pretty great result. But they are going to be learning a lot throughout the process.
So one of the things that we're going to be doing for everyone who participated, we will be sending tickets to go to the museum. So David will work on that behind the scenes and get that to everyone. But can you tell everyone a little bit about exactly where you're located and what a day at the museum looks like?
Sure. So we are at the Claremont County Airport in Batavia, Ohio, so just east of Cincinnati on State Route 32. We are open to the public on Wednesdays from 4 to 7 and Saturdays from 10 to 3. It all depends on your interest level, how many short people you have with you, and their tolerance for looking at airplanes. So I've given tours that last 15 minutes, and I've given tours that last 7 hours. The reality is it's all up to you. We have a pretty amazing staff of volunteer docents who will take you around and answer any question you have. And they'll spend as much time as you want doing that. one of their strengths is storytelling. And so if you let them, they'll keep talking to you. So there's a little caveat there. But if you want to come and take your own time and bring your camera and do your own thing and just walk around and look at airplanes, and you know all the facts and figures on a B-25 and you don't need one of our guys telling you about it, you can do that as well. So, you know, personally, I would say budget 2 hours. That's a pretty, you know, 90 minutes to 2 hours is a pretty decent average. But if you're, you know, an airplane nut, you can spend all day here pouring over details of these amazing machines.
And there's a follow-up question. Are reservations required?
No. Like I said, we're open Wednesdays from 4 to 7 and Saturdays from 10 to 3. Just come on in the door. We've seen a pretty solid downturn since November, so we'd be glad to have you.
Are there any other questions? If so, please feel free to take yourself off mute or to put them in the chat box. David, while we're waiting, I just want to read to you a couple of comments. Thank you. This has been a wonderful presentation and really enjoyed this. Thank you so much. So it's
been my
great.
pleasure.
Yeah. So if there are no other questions, I would just like to once again thank everyone for being a part of this event. If you missed us at the beginning, this is Seasons Retirement Community and Grace Hospice. Grace Hospice is a level 2, We Honor Veterans level 2 sponsor. This has been Tri State Warbird Museum located in Claremont County. And David, we do have a couple of additional questions. The first one is one that I am going to answer because I actually know the answer to it. Super proud of me. Yes, the video will be available afterward. It's going to take just a little bit of time for it to load. So please look for that in your email, probably in the next 48 hours. I will ask that if everyone could, if you are interested in getting the video, and especially if you're interested in getting tickets, please just put that information, put your email address in the chat box. You can put it for everyone, or you can just send it to my attention, whatever you prefer, but that way I can get everything out. And I will be getting your addresses when I email you. So David, for you, the question is there anything for kids, such as things that are interactive? Are they able to actually touch any of the planes, sit in them? Tell us a little bit about the experience for the little people.
Absolutely, that's a great question. So we started a program last year called Super Soarin' Saturdays, and it's a entirely kid-focused, education-centered program for children, roughly speaking, 5 to 11. And we just had one this past Saturday, and each one is themed around a certain aspect of the aviation in general, and there's STEM focused aspects of each program, along with, you know, fun stuff. Like last week, the theme was flight and the physics of flight, how airplanes work, what the forces involved really are, and how an airplane accomplishes that goal. And so they built paper airplanes, and they were, you know, assisted along in the process of how to build a better airplane to make it fly longer and that kind of stuff. We've got an experimental home-built non-military aircraft called a Heath Parasol, which will be on the camera here in just a second, that we were given a couple years ago. And every kid got to get in it and kick the rudders and move the control stick around and see the ailerons move up and down and look at the rudder. And it's a very basic flying machine, but it's got all the principles there that kind of can show you what it's really like to make an airplane fly and learn what really is going on there that you can't see. So that program was Saturday. You can, if you're interested, I think we've got 2 or 3 on the calendar for the next 6 to 9 months. And those will be on our website as they get closer to happening. Additionally, we've got homeschool programs and homeschool programming and tours, school tour groups, all that kind of stuff. And then beyond that, all of our tour guides are really good at adapting the tour and the material to the audience. So if you've got young kids, they're all pretty good at, you know, knowing their audience and teaching to who's listening. But in terms of little ones, Superstore on Saturdays, it's our kid-focused Saturday program. I think there's three on the calendar right now. We've been calling audibles all over the place due to COVID, so we've had to pare down a lot of the programming to kind of comply with all of those rules. But I believe there's 3 left on the calendar for this year. So if you're interested, Facebook, Instagram, website, all those places will have information on that.
All right, and any final questions for David?
I'll take that to mean that I said everything right and there weren't any corrections needed.
I think you said it all right. We have Colonel Byrne here. He's Sheenan's dad, who is our amazing videographer for the evening. He says, I love the presentation and the obvious attention to detail. He is a huge fan of the P-51 and FW-190. He can't wait to visit and see the awesome aircraft up close. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you for your kind words, and we look forward to seeing you.
As we wrap up, again, thank you so much for being here. We were so excited that David and the Tri State Warbird Museum was able to be the first of many Vet2Vet Café events. Grace Hospice, We Honor Veterans, and Seasons is so incredibly excited that we were going to be offering a monthly presentation with something focused for our veterans as well as active duty military. We will keep you in touch. We will keep in touch with you, let you know what our next events are going to be. If you did send to me the information so that I can get in contact with you to get you your tickets, you will be getting an email from me again within the next 48 hours. I will be emailing out information for our next events as well. For all of our veterans and active military who are on the call, thank you so much for your service. We appreciate you more than you could possibly know, and we're so happy that we were able to spend this time with you today. So again, David, thank you so much for everything. We will keep the camera going for a little bit, so everyone can watch. And if you
we can walk around and look at cool stuff. Well, thanks for having me.